What if McLaren's real leader this weekend was not Lando Norris, but Oscar Piastri? Because what happened in Albert Park during the first sessions was not simply a good fast lap in front of his home crowd. It was something much deeper. He was a driver who from the first turns showed an immediate connection with the car, a perfect reading of the track and a consistency that not even his own team expected to see so early in the weekend. While other teams were still trying to understand the behavior of their cars and adjust settings, Piastri was already setting the pace of the group, sending a very clear message to the paddock, and also within the McLaren garage itself. Because in free practice 1 there were already signs that something interesting was happening. McLaren did not look like the dominant car and the team was working with high fuel loads and different settings, but even in that context Piastri looked extremely solid, lapping cleanly without errors and staying close to the best times without yet seeking a qualifying lap. And when the second session arrived, everything changed. With soft tires he posted a 1 minute and 19.729 seconds that placed him at the top of the table, surpassing drivers like Kimi Antonelli and George Russell in a complicated session where many failed to complete perfect laps. But the most important thing was not just the fastest lap, but the consistency of his runs and the feeling of total control over the car throughout the session. As the session progressed, the engineers began to notice something interesting in the telemetry data. Piastri was not only fast in specific sectors, but he maintained a very stable balance throughout the track, especially in the technical areas of Albert Park where the car needs a perfect combination of braking stability and traction on corner exit. This type of consistency is something that usually appears later in the weekend, when the drivers have already completed several runs and the teams have adjusted the balance of the car. However, in Piastri's case that stability seemed to come from the beginning. Even with hard tires and without seeking qualifying times, his gap to the leaders was relatively small, reinforcing the idea that the McLaren had hidden potential and that the Australian was understanding very well how to extract that performance without compromising the balance of the car. But the key moment came when the teams began to prepare for the second training session. With the track more rubberized and different temperatures, practice 2 is usually the moment in which the true intentions of the teams begin to be seen, especially when they mount the soft tires to simulate qualifying laps. It was precisely in that context that Oscar Piastri delivered the first serious blow of the weekend. His lap of 1 minute and 19.729 seconds not only put him in first position of the session, but he also did so with a clear advantage over drivers who were having a competitive Friday like Kimi Antonelli and George Russell. In a session where many drivers had difficulty completing clean laps due to traffic and different program strategies, the Australian executed a practically perfect lap, taking advantage of every sector of the circuit and showing total confidence in the car's behavior. However, what really changed the perception within the paddock was not just that fast lap, but the analysis of his long runs during the session. Piastri completed a total of 26 laps with a very solid pace and with minimal differences between each lap, something that for engineers is usually a much more important indicator than an isolated spectacular lap. Even before installing the soft compound, he had already shown that the car had good performance with hard tires, running just 7/10 off the best time of the session at that time. This indicated that the transition between compounds was working correctly and that McLaren had a balanced car for both qualifying simulations and race pace. And throughout this process the driver who was leading the interpretation of the data and the pace on the track was clearly Oscar Piastri. This detail began to generate a small change in the narrative of Friday within the team. Traditionally, Lando Norris had been considered McLaren's natural reference in pure pace, especially in qualifying sessions. But during these initial practices, technical attention began to focus more on the work Piastri was doing. His radio comments, his ability to maintain consistency over long runs, and the way he found time in key sections of the circuit suggested he was getting a very clear read on the car's behavior. And when a driver achieves that so early in the weekend, it usually means he has room to continue improving as the team optimizes the setup. Therefore, at the end of Friday in Albert Park, the feeling inside the McLaren garage was quite different from what many expected before starting the Grand Prix. The Australian had not only been the fastest, he had also shown that he was completely in control of the situation from a technical and competitive point of view. As the engineers began to more calmly analyze all the information collected during Friday in Albert Park, the surprise within McLaren began to be even greater. Because it's one thing to set the best time in a practice session, something that can happen due to many variables such as fuel, engine mode, or time on the track, but it's quite another when deep data reveals that that performance was not circumstantial. And that was exactly what happened with Oscar Piastri. When the team compared the telemetry records between both cars, a very clear pattern emerged. The Australian had not only been fast on a specific lap, but was consistently finding performance in several areas of the circuit where it is normally difficult to make a difference. In particular, his passage through the medium-speed corners and his stability under long braking showed an advantage that indicated he was understanding the balance of the car better than anyone else at that point in the weekend. But the real difference appeared when the team analyzed the sectors of the fastest lap that put Piastri at the top of the table. In Albert Park there are very different areas. Fast straights, strong braking and sequences of curves where the aerodynamic balance of the car is essential. Normally drivers tend to excel in one part of the circuit and lose some time in another, but in Piastri's case the time was distributed extremely evenly throughout the entire lap. That means he wasn't relying on a single exceptional sector to build his time, but rather he was optimizing every part of the course with very clean execution. These types of laps are the ones that worry the rivals the most, because they indicate that there is still room for improvement if the driver manages to put together all the small details in the classification. At the end of Friday, the feeling within the paddock was clear. Oscar Piastri had not only been the fastest, but had established a very solid technical foundation for the rest of the Grand Prix. The data showed that his performance was not the product of a single lap, but the result of consistent execution, an accurate reading of the car and a perfect adaptation to the conditions of the circuit. And when all of these factors come together so early in the weekend, what often comes next is a much more interesting battle than many anticipated, especially within the McLaren team itself. Friday's closing at the Australian Grand Prix left a very different feeling than many expected before the weekend began. For years, within McLaren it had been assumed that Lando Norris would be the team's natural reference when it came to setting the pace in qualifying and leading car development during key sessions. However, what the data from the Albert Park practices showed began to pose a much more interesting scenario. Oscar Piastri had not only finished the day as the fastest driver, but he had done so with a type of performance that for engineers is much more revealing. Consistency in long runs, stability in different tire compounds, and a fast lap built in a balanced way in all sectors of the circuit. In other words, it didn't seem like an isolated performance on Friday, but rather the sign that the Australian had found something very important in his understanding of the car since the start of the weekend. Within the team this was beginning to generate a new type of competitive tension, but not in the negative sense, but in the way in which two drivers begin to push each other towards a higher level of performance. Norris was still extremely fast and was still working with engineers to adjust certain aspects of the car's balance, but the data showed that Piastri had managed to adapt to the specific conditions of the Melbourne circuit sooner. This means that the Australian was setting a very valuable internal reference for the team, something that often changes the work dynamic within the garage. When a driver finds performance early in the weekend, engineers can use that information as a basis to optimize both cars, which ends up benefiting the team as a whole. But at the same time it also generates a more intense internal rivalry, because each driver wants to show that they can be the leader on the track. Another factor that made this situation even more interesting was the emotional context of the event. For Oscar Piastri, the Australian Grand Prix is not just another race on the calendar. It is his home race, the moment when all the attention of the local public and the media is focused on him. Historically, that kind of pressure can take its toll on many drivers, especially when it comes to young talents who are still consolidating their position within a top team. However, Piastri's behavior throughout Friday conveyed exactly the opposite. His driving was clean, his radio commentary with the team was clear, and his ability to maintain a consistent pace over long runs showed a driver completely comfortable with the car and the context of the weekend. That type of confidence is something that can completely change the development of a Grand Prix, because it allows the driver to risk more when the key moment of qualifying arrives. Looking ahead to the rest of the weekend, the big question that remained open was whether that performance on Friday would also translate into a real advantage when the competitive sessions arrived. Free practice always has many hidden variables. Different fuel loads, different engine modes, and technical programs specific to each team. But even taking all of those factors into account, what Piastri's data showed was strong enough to think that McLaren had a very competitive car at Albert Park and that the Australian was in an ideal position to take advantage of it. If he managed to transfer that confidence and balance from the car to qualifying, the battle for pole position could have an unexpected protagonist in front of his own public. And that is where the Australian Grand Prix weekend began to take on an even more interesting dimension. Because if Oscar Piastri managed to maintain that level of performance, not only would he be fighting for a great result at home, but he could also begin to redefine the internal balance within McLaren against Lando Norris. In modern Formula One, hierarchies within teams are never completely fixed. They constantly change according to performance, driver confidence, and the evolution of the car. And what Friday's practices in Melbourne made clear is that Piastri was ready to take a step forward in that internal battle. The rest of the weekend would tell whether that first warning on Friday was just a momentary flash, or the beginning of something much bigger within McLaren. After analyzing everything that happened during the Friday of the 2026 Australian Grand Prix, the conclusion left by the start of the weekend is quite clear. Oscar Piastri not only had a good practice session, but he showed a level of control and understanding of the car that could change the narrative within McLaren. From the first laps in practice 1, it was already clear that the Australian was working with a very solid base, riding cleanly, without errors, and staying close to the best times even when the team was not yet looking for fast laps. And when it came time to show true pace in practice 2, that foundation ended up transforming into a very serious display of performance with the best time of the session and extremely consistent runs throughout the Albert Park circuit. Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.